I thought Moosonee might be an interesting town to visit, right on the tip of James Bay, one of the first locations of the Hudson's Bay Company when North America was being colonized. There were no roads that led to Moosonee. The closest you could get by car was the town of Cochrane, northern Ontario, and from there it was a 4-hour train ride to Moosonee. I found the town to be a bit bleak and dreary, although I got along well with the innkeeper at the place I was staying. It was pretty cold too, although I visited in the middle of July. I was only really there for a weekend, and I was looking forward to this 8 p.m. train ride. The train ride was the most relaxing part of the trip, but staring out my window I realized that the nature around here was kind of bleak as well. Small, grayed-out evergreen trees stewing in something of a fen, but the sunset was beautiful out my western window. I declined snacks. I had a few granola bars of my own. The train was pretty empty. I shared my cabin with only one other young family, parents, and a girl that looked to be about 7 years old. It was a bit of a bumpy ride, but that was part of what I enjoyed. There was something extremely soothing about getting jostled around in a large vehicle. I almost always fell asleep. The little girl diagonal from me had to use the washroom and petitioned her father to come with her. I watched the two make their way down the aisle to use the washroom close to the junction of the train cars. The father waited outside as his daughter entered the washroom. I looked out the window as the last glimmer of light was fading in the sky, and I heard yelling from the front of the train, almost like a stage whisper, almost inaudible over all the wind. There was a loud scrape, followed by a massive crashing noise. My head jolted forward to see what was going on. As I looked through the windows between the train cars, it looked as though the hallway was bending. It took a moment for me to make sense of what was going on, but I quickly realized we were derailing. The father up in front of the bathroom realized it too, and panicked, knocking on the door. "Julia! Julia, come out!" he yelled. I had no idea what to do. I felt the right side of the train lift into the air, and as we tilted, I held onto my chair as tightly as I could. I braced with every ounce of strength I had, and our car of the train came crashing into the gutter. The crash itself happened so fast, I had no idea what was really going on. I could hear a dog barking and yelping, screaming coming from what felt like every direction, glass shattering and water splashing as we entered the fen. I gnashed my teeth as we continued to skid, and they chipped as I bit, until finally we came to a screeching halt. The lights were off. It was dark in the train, as the bottom now shielded us from the twilight. I could barely believe I was still in my seat. I looked over at where the family had sat. The mother's body was lying there, a trickle of blood running down her head. She hung half out of her seat, so that her head was just touching the water of the fen through the smashed glass of the window. Her arm was extended towards a bag, and half hanging out of the bag was a small dachshund floating in the fen as well. Oh, that's sad, I thought to myself. You weren't supposed to bring animals on board, though. I looked down the hall, and the father was nowhere to be seen. The bathroom door was still closed as well, and all was quiet, all but the sound of crickets. I looked for a way out before loosening my grip. The last thing I needed was to fall into the water below. A few feet to my right was my own smashed window. I could easily climb out of it. That is, if I could get good footing somehow. I shoved my shoe in between the seats in front of me and pivoted my body. I brushed away broken glass from the frame of the window and hoisted myself up. I climbed to the top of the train and peered out towards the front. The engine car was crumpled beyond belief as it had smashed through much of the forest. I checked myself for injuries in what remained of the twilight, sitting down cross-legged on top of the train, but all I could see was a small cut on my arm, and possibly some whiplash, but I wouldn't really know till the next day. Next, I navigated a path back onto the train tracks from the fen. Gazing down towards the end of the train, the caboose appeared to be only a meter away from the train track. If I just walked along the train, I'd be able to get over the ditch easily back onto the train track by jumping from the caboose. I put this plan into action as coyotes howled in the west. The jump was a bit wider than I realized after I reached the caboose, but I made it. We had only been on the train for about 20 minutes before it derailed, and I peered down the train tracks towards Moosonee. There was a chance I could make it there on foot, but it might take a while, an hour or two. I definitely had no chance of making it to Cochrane by morning. "Daddy?" A little girl's voice sounded from the fen below. I gasped and looked around to see the girl, Julia, wading through the fen. Ugh, I hadn't had kids in an attempt to waive responsibility, but here I was, having to be responsible. A coyote howled again in the west, on the opposite side of the track from where the train crashed. I could not leave that little girl alone. The coyotes would definitely make a snack of her. A grown man, on the other hand, would be more trouble for them. "Daddy?" she called out again into the night. I walked back along the train tracks to try to help her up from the ditch. I knew her parents were as good as dead, but I didn't know how to break it to her. "Hey, Julia, can you give me your hand?" I called down to her. She looked up, not able to see me in the darkness. "Daddy, is that you?" "No, I'm not your dad, but I'm here to help." "Where's my daddy?" she called up. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." "He's up here, he's busy, he told me to come get you." I lied. I really did not like being in a situation like this. "Okay," she agreed, extending her hand, and I helped her out of the water. "Hey, where's my daddy?" she asked me upon arriving on the tracks and realizing it was just the two of us. "He's back in town. It's going to be a bit of a long walk, okay? Let me know if you get tired and I'll carry you." I turned to face Musonee. "I don't believe you," she told me. "I think you're lying." She huffed and crossed her arms, ripping her hand away from mine. I pinched my forehead, trying to think about how to do this. "Noodle? Is that you, Noodle?" I looked up to see what the little girl was talking about. She was running off the tracks to the west, after a small dog, a coyote. There was something unpleasant about this coyote. It had a green glare in its eye. It looked intelligent. The beast looked over to me, and then back to the girl. It waited for the little girl to run over to it, and then turned, slid down the ditch, and ran into the woods. "Noodle, come back!" The little girl chased after the coyote, mistaking it for her dead dachshund. I don't know why I couldn't move. I felt frozen in place as I watched her disappear into the darkness of the woods. Why hadn't I tried to stop her? Why hadn't I just picked her up and carried her to Musonee? I felt utterly incompetent as I emerged from my brain fog. I slid down the ditch and ran after her into the dark woods myself. Luckily, I was able to track her by the sound of her voice as she continued calling out for Noodle. I pulled up the flashlight on my phone camera to check my footing before making steps through this thick bramble. I didn't know how she was managing. I could barely see the back of her yellow parka, some tens of meters ahead of me. I don't know how far we went into the woods, but it felt like we were going for a long time. "Julia!" I yelled out to her, trying to command her to come back, but she wasn't having any of it. After about 10 minutes of this, she stopped. The back of her yellow parka became more clear. She was standing still. She had stopped communicating. Only a meter ahead of her, the coyote stood, not attacking. It was facing her directly. It almost looked to be communicating with her, and she was listening to it. My first instinct was to run up to the coyote and boot it away, but my second instinct told me that there was something much more malevolent happening here. I kept a safe cushion of space between myself and Julia. "Julia, please come with me." Julia didn't turn around, but the coyote turned to look at me. Slowly, Julia followed, turning around with a series of small steps and looking at me with a green glow in her eyes. "Please help me, mister," she said, expressionless. She looked to be sleepwalking. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned and fled. Some instinct I had was telling me that if I turned around even for a second, I would be dead. My phone flashlight was doing serious work getting me out of the forest without tripping. I could hear the little girl's footsteps running after me, and the coyote's near hers. It was panting, happily, like a dog. I scrambled up the ditch and back onto the train track and bolted down as fast as I could on the gravel towards Mousonnet. I allowed myself to turn back once to look behind me. I watched 2 pairs of green eyes fade into the distance and allowed my pace to slow somewhat. I wouldn't have been able to continue to run otherwise. I could feel voices and eyes all around me as I continued to run for what felt like hours in the darkness. I only tripped once as my foot caught one of the rungs of the train track. Naturally, I panicked, thinking I was being attacked, but I got back up and just kept running with a gash in my knee. It's amazing what your body is able to do when your mind believes death is imminent. I actually made it back to Mousonnet, and the first place I thought to go was the inn where I stayed over the weekend. I tried the door, but it was locked, and I pounded on it frantically, looking behind me and seeing nothing up on the mound where the track was. The door opened, and the innkeeper who I had come to know looked surprised to see me. "What happened to you?" "The train derailed, and then I was being chased by a coyote," I told him. "The train derailed?" He looked shocked and invited me inside. He locked the door behind us and sat me down by the fireplace with a cup of tea. I could hear him behind the bar, reporting the derailed train to the appropriate authorities, and when he got off the horn, he came over to me, a drink in hand, and took a seat next to me. I was still trembling a bit. "Tell me about this coyote," he asked. "Well, there was this little girl I was trying to save. She wouldn't come with me, and then she saw the coyote. The coyote had green eyes, turned and went into the woods, and she followed it. I knew that I wasn't making much sense, but he perked up all the same." "Oh dear, that sounds like a skinwalker." The innkeeper peered out the window behind me towards the hill where the train track sat. "Is that the one?" he asked. I whirled around to look at the top of the hill. There was indeed a coyote with green eyes sitting there, staring through the window at the back of my head. I slinked back into my chair to avoid being seen. The innkeeper casually walked up and shut the curtains. "I guess that is the one," he chuckled. I'd heard of skinwalkers before, years ago on the internet, but I couldn't really recall the details of what they were, only that they could shapeshift into animals and also get inside the heads of animals and humans to manipulate them. "Was the little girl your daughter?" the innkeeper asked. "No, she wasn't mine. I was just trying to do a good thing. Ugh, I do feel bad though. She's probably long eaten by now." "I don't think so," the innkeeper said, still peeking through the curtains up to the hill. "No, I think he wants you." My eyes went wide, and I poked my head out of the curtains to see what he was looking at. Julia emerged from the darkness behind the coyote and sat next to it, eyes still glowing green, peering back down at me. I slinked back into the corner of the room once more, and I began trembling again. Why would it want me?" I asked the innkeeper. "Skinwalkers don't need to eat humans for food," he told me. "They hunt humans for sport. No, there wouldn't be much fun for him in killing her. But of course, if you don't take his bait, he'll probably try to make you watch as he does. But what could I even do? How could I even fight him? Don't they shapeshift into some massive creature? They're a little taller than a human, yeah, but they're light. When I was just a boy, my father took me out hunting in these woods. We encountered a skinwalker and he shot it. It bled. I sat back, feeling guilty and selfish for wanting to stay safe and sacrifice the life of this girl. The innkeeper wasn't pushing me to do anything, but I could feel his judgment. "Do you have any guns?" I asked him, thinking the answer would be no, and wanting him to stop judging me. "Oh yeah," he replied. "2 semi-automatics, in fact." "Oh, great. Would you be willing to come help me?" I asked, putting him on the spot for a change. The innkeeper stepped back from the curtains and looked down at me. "I'll come with you. I can't let this little girl's life weigh on my conscience. Stop cowering. Get up. Let's do this." I couldn't believe this was happening as I prepared myself. The innkeeper even had some light Kevlar that we strapped up with. I'd never actually used a gun before, and in a few minutes I was back out in the cold night air, trembling like a leaf. The coyote and the girl were gone from the hill. It was like it had access to a piece of my thoughts, and when I really leaned back into my own mind, I felt like I could feel it as well. I knew it was waiting for me somewhere in the forest. We climbed the hill with the train track and ventured west into the forest. The blackness was all-encompassing, and I could hear little voices and murmurs in the trees. I looked up and around to see dozens of green eyes staring down at me. Squirrels, birds, all sorts of smaller, harmless animals. I could feel the Skinwalker whispering to me through their little squeaks and chirps that lighted the forest in a hum of activity. A pair of larger green eyes came lumbering up through the darkness. The innkeeper raised his rifle and shot the creature between the eyes. There was a heavy thud as the animal collapsed to the ground. It was a black bear. It was no shape-shifted skinwalker, though, just a possessed thrall. Come to think of it, any one of these birds or squirrels could be the skinwalker. But as I gazed up into each of their eyes, somehow I knew that none of them were. "You're gonna die, mister." Julia's voice resonated through the forest. My heart was pounding. I believed she was right. "Shh, there it is," the innkeeper whispered to me aggressively as the forest went dead silent. The large high beam of his flashlight revealing the coyote, its back turned to us, licking its paws some distance away. The innkeeper lifted his gun to his eye to stare at the coyote down his sights. His finger readied itself on the trigger, ready to blow its brains out before it could react. Something didn't feel right to me. The coyote turned to face us, its eyes glowing green, and the innkeeper took the shot. The animal went down without a fight, or even so much as a whimper. The innkeeper began walking over to it, closing the distance. Something in my gut told me that this was not the Skinwalker. I heard a twig snap from between the trees at the edge of the clearing on the left of the innkeeper. I turned on my flashlight just in time to see it lunge out of the darkness. It was about 7 feet tall. It had a humanoid shape, but long, slender, knife-like fingers. It had an additional joint in its hind legs like a dog or a cat that likely made it easier to jump. It was a pale white all the way down its body, and it had a humanoid head with humanoid teeth. But where its eyes should have been, there was only skin. It was incredibly thin and wiry looking. The innkeeper gasped and turned just as the knife-like fingers of the Skinwalker plunged into his gut. It tried to tear them down the length of the man's abdomen, but he grabbed hold of its fingers to stop that from happening. The roar of the creature sounded like an old man's last wheeze, like its vocal cords barely functioned. I lifted my rifle and fired several shots towards its body. I knew I wouldn't be able to hit its head. The Skinwalker wrestled with the innkeeper on the ground, trying to free its fingers. It clearly had been expecting an easy kill, and then to take its sweet time killing me. But this innkeeper had a lot of fight in him. I tagged the Skinwalker as red blood spilled out onto the soil. I took steps to get closer. I knew that I had no chance of hitting the innkeeper as long as I kept aiming high. The Skinwalker turned to roar at me in the same freakish wheeze, saliva flying out of its mouth between its square array of incisors. A lucky shot hit it square in the forehead, right where its eyes should have been, and it went down, twitching. The innkeeper was able to pull its fingers out straight, and was now taking his shirt off to wrap around his wound. I walked right up to the Skinwalker as it twitched, and fired 3 more shots. 2 of them which hit its head. The 3rd missed. I was still trembling, still terrified, and after a few more moments the twitching subsided. "Quick, take my knife, cut off its head," the innkeeper told me, and I did as he said. The sinew of its neck was tough to get through, but I managed to decapitate it. "Find the girl," he told me. Oh, right. I had almost completely forgot why we came out there. "Mister?" A voice called to me from the growth. I couldn't believe I was seeing her alive, and with the glow gone from her eyes. I couldn't carry the innkeeper, but I removed my shirt, put it under him and dragged him through the forest back out so that he wouldn't lose as much blood. I made sure Julia followed me this time too. Believe it or not, the innkeeper survived. It took a couple weeks to get another train out to get us back to Cochrane. Julia was sent to a good orphanage. I'm still not ready to be a parent, but I'm sure she'll be adopted in no time. She was adorable. The innkeeper put the head of the Skinwalker in preservatives, and it now sits over his fireplace. Apparently that's why he wanted me to decapitate it. It would have been dead anyway. That guy was a character. Hey guys, thanks for listening to that story. Hope you enjoyed it. I know it's been a minute since I did a longer story, but I know the Skinwalker is a popular cryptid and I wanted to do it as much justice as I could. Subscribe and hit the bell for new original creepypastas every Thursday, and tune in on Sunday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nightmare Theater, an open book club for nightmares. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.